Hey kiddos, Mr. Salisbury here, back again to read and kind of think about the next few chapters. I'm hopeful that we can meet here sometime soon and really talk in person about what's happened, because after today we're only going to be 8 chapters in of, there's 20 and something chapters, so we barely even scratched the surface, and I feel like there's a lot to talk about already. If there is not a lot to talk about, there's going to be after I read today. Okay, so to give you a little recap of where we are in the story, okay, 3 events occurred at the 3 different times of the day: morning, afternoon, and evening. Okay, in the morning, the Maytuck wakes up and is excited to go see her boys. Then in the afternoon, we have Winnie, who's out front and is a little bit upset about her relationship with her parents or grandmother, and how overbearing that they are towards her, or how she feels that way anyway. And then the third event is a stranger came and asked if they own the wood. They were asking some questions, kind of a weird guy, and they heard a music box, or they heard music that was coming from the wood. Okay, the grandmother thinks it's elves, right? I mean, of course, we're talking about the late 1900s, or late 1800s. I'm sorry, and so some people believe in those types of things, particularly back then when, science and technology wasn't what it was. And so that is where we left off. Okay. And so what we're going to do is that today we're going to read chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay? And what you're going to start to see is how these 3 things come together. By the end of chapter 8, you're not going to really know how everything's going to eventually work out, but you are going to see how these 3 events come together. Okay? So hopefully you have finished your vocabulary. It's important you know them. And it's going to be something that we continue to go through. And without further ado, please turn your books to page 22, okay, which is chapter 5. 22, chapter 5, and as before, please do follow along in your book as you're reading or as you're listening. Don't just listen, okay? It's important that you do follow along as you listen. You look at the words as you go through them. The reason that is myself in particular, I'm not a very good speller, and I used to listen to a lot of books on tape, and I'd have this wonderful vocabulary, but since I always only heard the word and never saw it, I could never spell it. And so I would have these words that I would want to use in my writing that I didn't even know how to start, because I'd never actually seen the word before. I've only heard it, particularly in the English language where there's some, the silent letter. I wouldn't know how to spell it. And so now that I'm reading, I still like to read books on tape, but I also buy the book and follow along, and it's really helped me. I'm hopeful that that'll be the case for you as well. So, chapter 5. When he woke up early the next morning, the sun was only just opening its own eye on the eastern horizon, and the cottage was full of silence. But she realized that sometime during the night she had made up her mind. She would not run away today. Where would I go anyway? She asked herself. There's nowhere else I'd really want to be. But in another part of her head, the dark part, where her oldest fears were housed, she knew there was another sort of reason for staying at home. She was afraid to go away alone. It was one thing to talk about being by yourself, doing important things, being quite another when the opportunity arose. The characters in the story she always read seemed to go off without a thought or care. But in real life, well, the world was a dangerous place. People were always telling her so. And she would not be able to manage without protection. They were always telling her that too. No one ever said precisely what it was that she would not be able to manage. But she did not need to ask. Her own imagination supplied the horrors. Still, it was galling, this having to admit that she was afraid. And when she remembered the toad, she felt even more disheartened. What if the toad should be out by the fence again today? What if he should laugh at her secretly and think that she was a coward? Remember, the very last thing she said to the toad is, "You don't think I'll do it? I'm going to do it. You watch, I'll do it." And now the moment has come, and she's like, "Wow, the reality is hitting her." And she's like, "Geez, this is a lot more scary than I thought." I think we can agree with that. That sometimes in our mind things are a lot easier until you actually have to do them. And you're like, "Ooh, this is tough." Well, anyway, she could at least slip out right now. She decided and go into the wood to see if she could discover what had really made the music the night before. That would be something anyway. She did not allow herself to consider the idea that making a difference in the world might require a bolder venture. She merely told herself, consolingly, "Of course, while I'm in the wood, if I decide never to come back, well then, that will be that." She was able to believe in this because she needed to, and believing was her own true, promising friend once more. And so she's leaving the house. She's not supposed to leave the front yard, right? And so she's kind of running away, but she has plans to come back, like later that day, unless things go fine, and maybe she'll just run away. Remember, she's just a kid, so anytime there's I'm talking to the book here, you'll see that it's more than just a new paragraph. It's actually like a whole new section. What that means is time has passed, okay? And so there's going to be some type of passing of time, a new idea. Sometimes there'll be new chapters when that occurs, but if it's the same idea, but time has passed, they'll do that. Sometimes you even see like 3 dots in the middle, which is kind of showing a new part. And usually that means time has passed. It was another heavy morning, already hot and breathless. But in the wood, the air was cooler and smelled agreeably damp. Winnie had been no more than 2 slow minutes walking timidly under the interlacing branches when she wondered why she had never come here before. "Why, it's nice," she thought with great surprise, for the wood was full of light, entirely different from the light that she was used to. It was green and amber and alive, quivering in splotches on the padded ground, fanning into sturdy stripes between the tree trunks. There were little flowers she did not recognize, white and palest blue, and endless tangled vines, and here and there a fallen log, half rotted but soft with patches of sweet green velvet moss. You can tell that she was an artist before an author. Her description, particularly her visual descriptions of things, are just awesome. I cannot, her descriptions are the best that I've seen in books. Her descriptions of things and the way that she uses things that we would normally describe humans as having, and using that to describe things. Okay, so she would say something like, "The house is very happy," right? Well, the house can't really be happy, but we kind of know what that means. It's called personification. She's wonderful with that, and boy, her descriptive detail is that paragraph is beautifully written, and it's just describing what she's saying. And there were creatures everywhere. The air fairly hummed with their daybreak activity. Beetles and birds and squirrels and ants and countless other things unseen, all gentle and self-absorbed and not in the least alarming. There was even, she saw with satisfaction, the toad. It was squatting on a low stump, and as she might not have noticed it, for it looked more like a mushroom than a living creature sitting there. As she came abreast of it, however, it blinked, and the movement gave it away. "See," she exclaimed, "I told you I'd be here first thing in the morning." The toad blinked again and nodded. Now, okay, so this story is, fictional, but everything that's in the story is kind of done in realistic terms, aside from this living forever thing. So the toad didn't really wink at her, right? It's kind of what she perceives. So one could say that this book is fantasy because there's a major concept in here that is fantastical. However, that is the only thing in this book that is fantasy. Okay, so I want you to think as if everything is real. Okay, there's no one can be flying, nothing like that. Okay, everything is real except this one little thing. Or perhaps it was only swallowing a fly. But then it nudged itself off the edge of the stump and vanished into the underbrush. It must have been watching for me, said Winnie to herself, and she was very glad she had come. She wandered for a long time, looking at everything, listening to everything, proud to forget the tight, pruned world outside, humming a little now, trying to remember the pattern of the melody she had heard the night before. And then up again in the place where the light seemed brighter, in the ground somewhat more open, something moved. Winnie stopped abruptly and crouched down. If it's really elves, she thought, I can have a look at them. And though her instinct was to turn and run, she was pleased to discover that her curiosity was stronger. So she wanted to run, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Okay, I can relate with that. Sometimes I get so curious, I get into something, and then next thing I know, I'm in trouble because the fear wasn't there to tell me, hey, I should probably stop. She's very curious. She began to creep forward. She would go just close enough, she told herself, just close enough to see, and then she would turn and run. But when she came near, up behind a sheltering tree trunk, and peered around it, her mouth dropped open, and all thought of running melted away. There was a clearing directly in front of her, at the center of which was an enormous tree thrust up, and thick roots rumpling the ground 10 feet around in every direction. Sitting relaxed with his back against the trunk was a boy, almost a man. And he seemed so glorious to Winnie that she lost her heart at once. I want you to think about point of view here. I want you to think about what it's like to be her. She has no friends. She can't leave her house. Seeing any person that's a kid that's around your same age is going to be like, wow, I would be like thirsty to talk to them. I don't even care who they are or what they look like. And so she comes around the corner and she sees this boy. And she's just like, wow, this is wonderful. Maybe, he could be a friend or who knows what, right? But she's looking for companionship. And she may have, she tried to find it a little bit with the frog, but you can't be a companion with an animal. And I think she's thirsty for that, and she may have see something in this boy to fulfill her loneliness, because she seems to be a very lonely little girl. He was thin and sunburned, this wonderful boy, with a thick mop of curly brown hair, and he wore his battered trousers and loose, grubby shirt with as much self-assurance as if they were silk and satin, meaning he looks dirty, but he doesn't care. A pair of green suspenders, more decorative than useful, gave the finishing touch, for he was shoeless, and there was a twig tucked between the toes of one foot. He waved the twig idly as he sat there, his face turned up to a gaze at the branches far above him. The golden morning light seemed to glow all around him, while brighter patches fell, now on his lean, brown hands, now on his hair and face, as the leaves stirred over his head. Wonderful description. Wow. Then he rumbled an ear carelessly, rubbed an ear carelessly, yawned, and stretched. Shifting his position, he turned his attention to the little pile of pebbles next to him. As Winnie watched, scarcely breathing, he moved the pile carefully to one side, pebble by pebble. Beneath the pile, the ground was shiny wet. The boy lifted a final stone, and Winnie saw a low spurt of water arching up and returning like a fountain into the ground. He bent and put his lips to the spurt, drinking noiselessly. And then he sat up again and drew his shirt sleeve across his mouth. As he did this, he turned his face in her direction, and their eyes met. For a long moment they looked at each other in silence, the boy with his arm still raised in his mouth. Neither of them moved. At last his arm fell to his side. "You may as well come out," he said with a frown. When he stood up embarrassed and because of that, resentful. "I didn't mean to watch you," she protested as she stepped into the clearing. "I didn't know anyone would be here." The boy eyed her as she came forward. "What are you doing here?" he asked her sternly. "It's my wood," said Winnie, surprised by the question. "I could come here whenever I want to. At least, I was never here before, but I could have come any time." "Oh," said the boy, relaxing a little. "You're one of the Fosters, then." "I'm Winnie," she said. "Who are you?" "I'm Jesse Tuck," he answered. "How do?" and put out a hand. Winnie took his hand, staring at him. He was even more beautiful up close. "Do you live nearby?" she managed at last, letting go of his hand reluctantly. "I never saw you before. Do you come here a lot?" "No one's supposed to. It's our wood." Then she added quickly, "It's all right, though, if you come. I mean, it's all right with me." The boy grinned. "No, I don't live nearby, and no, I don't come here often. Just passing through. And thanks, I'm glad it would be all right with you." "That's good," said Winnie, irreverently. She stepped back and sat down primly on short distance from him. "How old are you anyway?" she asked, squinting at him. There was a pause, and at last he said, "Why do you want to know?" "I'm just wondering," said Winnie. "All right, I'm 104 years old," he told her solemnly. "No, I mean really," she persisted. "Well then," he said, "if you must know, I'm 17. 17? That's right." "Oh," said Winnie hopelessly. 17, that's old." "You have no idea," he agreed with a nod. Winnie had a feeling he was laughing at her. So it's like he had an inside joke, but she's not part of it, right? That he was laughing at her, but decided it was nice. It was a nice kind of laughing. "Are you married?" she asked next. This time he laughed out loud. "No, I'm not married, are you?" Now it was Winnie's turn to laugh. "Of course not," she said. "I'm only 10, so she's 10. But I'll be 11 pretty soon." "And then you'll get married?" he suggested. Winnie laughed again, her head on one side, admiring him. And then she pointed to the spurt of water. "Is that good to drink?" she asked. "I'm thirsty." Jesse Tuck's face was instantly serious. "Oh, that? No, it's not," he said quickly. "You mustn't drink from it. Comes right from up from the ground. Probably pretty dirty." And he began to pile the pebbles over it again. "But you drank some," Winnie reminded him. "Oh, did you see that?" He looked at her anxiously. "Well, me, I'll drink anything. I mean, I'm used to it. I wouldn't be good for you, though." "Why not?" said Winnie. She stood up. "It's mine anyway. If it's in the wood, I want some. I'm about as dry as dust." And she went to where he sat, and knelt down beside the pile of pebbles. "Believe me, Winnie Foster," said Jessie, "it would be terrible if you drink any of this water. Just terrible. I cannot let you." "Well, I still don't see why not," said Winnie plaintively. "I'm getting thirstier every minute. If it didn't hurt you, it won't hurt me. If my pa was here, he'd let me have some." "You're not going to tell him about it, are you?" said Jessie. His face had gone very pale under the sunburn. He stood up and put a bare foot firmly on the pile of pebbles. "I knew this was going to happen sooner or later. Now what am I going to do?" So he's talking to himself, and Winnie's probably like, "What are you talking about?" As he said this, there was a crashing sound among the trees and a voice calling, "Jessie?" "Thank goodness," said Jessie, blowing out his cheeks in relief. "Here comes Ma and Miles. They'll know what to do." And sure enough, a big, comfortable-looking woman appeared, leading a fat old horse, and at her side was a young man almost as beautiful as Jessie. It was May Tuck, with her other son, Jessie's older brother. And at once, when she saw the two of them, Jessie with his foot on the pile of pebbles and Winnie on her knees beside him, she seemed to understand. Her hand flew to her bosom, gasping at the old brooch that fastened her shawl, and her face went bleak. "Well, boys," she said, "here it is. The worst is happening at last." Chapter 6. Afterward, when she thought about it, it seemed to Winnie that the next few minutes were only a blur. First, she was kneeling on the ground insisting on a drink from the spring, and next thing she knew, she was seized and swung through the air, open-mouthed, and found herself straddling the bouncing back of the fat old horse, with Miles and Jessie trotting along on either side, while May ran puffing ahead, dragging on her bridle. Winnie had often been haunted by visions of what it would be like to be kidnapped. But none of her visions had been like this, with her kidnappers just as alarmed as she was herself. They're taking her. She's being kidnapped. The difference is the kidnappers, May, Jessie, and Miles, are freaking out. They're freaking out probably more than she is. She had always pictured a troop of burly men with long black mustaches who would tumble into her blanket and bear her off like a sack of potatoes while she pleaded for mercy. But instead, it was they, May Tuck and Miles and Jessie, who were pleading. "Please, child, dear, dear child, don't you be scared." This was May trying to run and call back over her shoulder at the same time. We wouldn't harm you. Not for the world. If you'd yell or anything," this was Jessie, "someone might have heard you, and that's just too risky." And Miles said, "We'll explain it, soon as we're far enough away." Winnie herself was speechless. She clung to the saddle and gave herself up to the astonishing fact that, though her heart was pounding and her backbone felt like a pipe full of cold running water, her head was fiercely calm. Disconnected thoughts presented themselves one by one, as if they had been waiting in their turn in line. So she's thinking this to herself as she's being kidnapped, which is interesting because it's kind of all over the place. It's a tangent, which is kind of common when something really bad happens. Your brain just like goes weird, and it takes a while for it to get back. So this is what it's like to ride a horse. I was going to run away today anyway. What will they say when I'm not there for breakfast? I wish the toad could see me now. That woman is worried about me. Miles is taller than Jessie. I better duck if I don't want this next branch to knock me off. So her mind's all over the place. This is probably true when something like this happens. You don't know what's going on. They had come to the edge of the wood now, with no sign of slowing their rapid jog. The road where it angled across the meadow was just ahead, dazzling, white in the open sunlight. And there, standing on the road, was the man from the night before. The man in the yellow suit. This part's about to be important. Remember, the man in the yellow suit has already spoken to Winnie and has already spoken to Winnie's grandmother, right? He knows where Winnie lives and knows that Winnie has, the father is there and then the mother is there as well. Discovering him, seeing his surprise, Anne presented at once with choices. Winnie's mind perversely went blank. Instead of crying out for help, she merely goggled at him. As they fled past the spot where he stood, May Tuck was the only one who spoke, and the most that she could offer was, "Teaching our little girl how to ride." Only then did it come to Winnie that she ought to shout, wave her arms, do something. But the man had fallen away behind by that time, and she was afraid to let go of the saddle, afraid to turn around, lest she fall off the horse. In another moment it was too late. They had sped up the hill and down its other side, and the opportunity was lost. Remember, he knows all of that stuff. He knows what May just said was a lie, right? He knows that this is not May's daughter. After another few minutes, the road led them to a place where off to the left, a shallow stream looped near, with willows and sheltering scrubby bushes. "Stop!" cried May. "We'll stop here." Miles and Jessie grabbed at the horse's harness, and he pulled up abruptly, nearly toppling Winnie off over his neck. "Lift the poor child down," May gasped, her chest heaving. "We'll go catch our breath by the water and try to put things straight before we go on." But the explanation, once they had stumbled to the banks of the stream, came hard. May seemed embarrassed, and Miles and Jessie fidgeted, glancing at their mother uneasily. No one knew how to begin. For her part, Winnie, now that the running was over, began to comprehend what was happening, and with the comprehension, her throat closed and her mouth went dry as paper. This was no vision. This was real. Strangers were taking her away. They may do anything. They might never see her mother again. And then, thinking of her mother, she saw herself as small, weak, and helpless, and she began to cry, suddenly, crushed as much by outrage as by shock. May's tuck round face wrinkled in dismay. "Dear Lord, don't cry, please don't cry, child," she implored. "We're not bad people, truly we're not. We had to bring you. You'll see why in a minute, and we'll take you back just as soon as we can, tomorrow, I promise." When May said tomorrow, Winnie's sobs turned to wails. Tomorrow? It was like being told that she would be kept away forever. She wanted to go home now, at once, rush back to the safety of the fence, and her mother's voice from the window. May reached out to her, but she twisted away her hands over her face and gave herself up to weeping. "This is awful," said Jessie. "Can't you do something, Ma? This poor little tad." "We ought to have had a better plan than this," said Miles. "That's the truth," said May helplessly. "The dear Lord knows there's been time enough to think of one. And it had to happen sooner or later. We've been playing bone lucky it hasn't happened before now. Again, we don't even know what they're talking about. What happened, right? But I never expected it to be a child. She reached distractedly into her pocket of her skirt and took out the music box, and without thinking, twisted the winding key with trembling fingers. When the twinkling little melody began, Winnie's sobs slowed. She stood by the stream, her hand still over her face, and listened. Yes, it was the same music she had heard the night before. Somehow it calmed her. It was like a ribbon tying her to familiar things. She thought, when I go home, I'll tell Granny it wasn't the elf music after all. She wiped her face as well as she could with her wet hands and turned to May. That's the music I heard last night, she managed between recovering snuffles. When I was out in my yard, my granny said it was elves. Dear me, no, said May, peering at her hopefully. It's only my music box. I didn't suppose anyone could hear it. She held it out to Winnie. Do you want to take a look at it? It's pretty, said Winnie, taking the little box and turning it over in her hands. The winding key was still revolving, but more and more slowly the melody faltered. Another few widely spaced out notes planked, and then it stopped. Wind it up if you want to, said May, clockwise. Winnie turned the key. It clicked faintly, and then after several more turns the music began to play again, brisk from its fresh winding, and merry. No one who owned a thing like this could be too disagreeable. Winnie examined the painted roses and the lilies of the valley, and smiled in spite of herself. It's pretty, she repeated, handing it back to May. The music box had relaxed them all. Miles dragged a handkerchief from a back pocket and mopped his face, and May sank down heavily on a rock, pulling off the blue straw hat and fanning herself with it. Look here, Winnie Foster, said Jessie. We're friends. We really are. But you've got to help us. Come sit down, and we'll try to tell you why. I can't read anymore. It's too long. It's already half hour. I'm sorry. I can't read anymore. It's too long. But what I will do is, this is what I'll do. Because all of you are going to be in like different places, right? In order for you to be able to do the reading, you have to finish the vocabulary. And so some of you might be a little behind on the vocabulary, and so you can't get to the reading. And so what I'll do is that I'll post this as like the next assignment. But then I'll also post an additional one where I finish reading chapters 7 and 8. What we need to be is, I'm guessing, so, next week I'm going to be able to see you more often, and that's true for the next few weeks, but then, SOLs, right, start beginning of May. And so this week, try your best to try to get caught up, meaning that you've done all the vocabulary words and that you've read up to here, and then hopes that when we meet again next week, we're all on the same page and can really talk about what's been going on, and I can bring some things that I think you're going to be really interested in. For example, the music box is symbolic. The way that she actually turned the music box is symbolic. The way that she's talking about tomorrow, that seems like forever, is symbolic. Okay? And I'm going to tell you how, okay, and why. And those are the types of conversations that we need to have together. So make sure you guys are doing what you need to do. I know it's kind of a bummer to leave it on, hey, I'm going to tell you the main part of this whole story and then say, oh, gotta go. But such is time, right? So if you're listening to this, hopefully there is another video waiting for you for chapters 7 and 8. If not, make sure you're working on your vocabulary, and you will find out what this big story and secret that she has to keep for this family, in fact, is.